Tamagotchi, those virtual pets from the 1990s.
Talking about Tamagotchi virtual pets.
Tamagotchi is back. Hatch a Tamagotchi, the one and only from Bandai.
Tamagotchi is this little handheld device that you carry around and has a virtual pet inside of it that you can take care of. I thought these were so cool when I was a kid, and I was feeling kind of nostalgic, so I bought one online. But after messing around with it for a bit, I realized it doesn't really hold up that well. Basically, all you can do is feed the Tamagotchi, play a very simple number guessing game, and occasionally clean up their poop. That makes sense though, since the Tamagotchi actually came out in 1996, so we're working with something more than 25 years old at this point. It's 2022 though, and that got me thinking, what would a modern day version of a Tamagotchi look like? There's been remakes from Bandai on platforms like the DS with Corner Shop, and on mobile with My Tamagotchi Forever, as well as versions like Tamagotchi Pix, which is pretty interesting, has a camera on the back. But when I think of Tamagotchi, I don't think of these colorful, high-resolution games. I think of this dinky, handheld toy with this low-resolution, 1-bit, non-backlit screen with just a few buttons. So, a remake in my mind would use some sort of modern device that has similar limitations to the Tamagotchi, with a similar screen and limited inputs, along with being a handheld device, but also allowing me to program a game for it. If you're new here, you might not know where I'm going with this, but there is actually a device like that, and it's called the Playdate. It has a 1-bit, non-backlit display that's 400 by 240 pixels, but it's using a modern display that's much crisper. You can tell easily side by side. It's got only a few buttons, but also this crank on the side that can be used as an input mechanism. It also has a pretty decent CPU and a lot more memory to handle more intense calculations. But most importantly, you can create games for it with the free SDK and easily sideload it onto the device. I've already made a few games for it so far, so I feel more confident to try and tackle a slightly bigger project. Here's the plan. I give myself 2 weeks to make my own interpretation of a virtual pet game. It's a completely arbitrary deadline, but I think it makes it more interesting. It gives me more motivation to finish. Kind of like a self-imposed game jam. Let's do this. Day one was a lot of just trying to figure out what the game was going to be. I created this mock-up for what I planned for the game to look like, laying out the buttons for different game actions. For example, I've been playing this game called Core Keeper with my wife recently, so it got me thinking that I would love for there to be some sort of idle farming element to grow the food, instead of having infinite food like in Tamagotchi. So this button would lead to some sort of garden. I quickly coded up the button functionality in the game with a simple button press animation. With that out of the way, I decided that I wanted a day-night cycle in the game. I put together what the nighttime might look like, but the moving clouds and the moon was a little distracting, so I ended up just making it static. On day 2, I bought this 1-bit art asset pack since there was a bunch of animals in there that I thought I could use for pets in the game. I went through and picked out the pets I liked and started creating really simple animations for all of them. I don't know why there's a buff bunny in there, but it's my favorite for sure. I set up a state machine to have animations play and the pet to walk around in an idle state, but something wasn't right. Once I had it fixed, I went ahead and added all the different pets into the game. There was a total of 11 different pet types that you can eventually unlock. On days 3 to 5, I started working on what the garden would look like. It would just use a simple grid. Here's what I ended up with in-game. But I ran into a small issue. If I had to use the D-pad for navigating around the garden, the B button to go back to the home screen, and the A button to plant, there's no buttons left to select what seed to use. So I made it so using the crank would pull up this list of seeds from the side. There's 14 different fruits and vegetables to pick from. I really like the idea of starting with a small garden and gradually expanding it, so I added the ability to adjust the size of the grid. Here's what it might look like towards the start of the game when you haven't really upgraded the garden yet. Of course, at this point, there was no way to plant or harvest anything, so I spent the day implementing that. It was hard to remember what I planted, so I created this little display at the top to give some info. I sped up the growth for demonstration purposes, but in the final build they take about 15 to 20 minutes to grow. However, a problem I had was when I closed the game and opened it later, it didn't update all the crops. I fixed that by simply recording the time when a crop was planted and comparing it with the current time. And if enough time passed, I'd update the crop. I put together some scene management code and a scene transition, and it was looking pretty good on device. On day 6, I decided it was a good time to start working on the shop. My idea was for it to look like one of those Japanese vending machines, so I went to work creating the art for it. I took this picture I found online and ran it through a dithering algorithm to get the background, and the final result looked like this. I was pretty happy with it, so I went ahead and implemented it into the game. I created a currency system with gems and a little info display on the right side. I keep track of what day it is, and so every day the shop will have different items, which I'm hoping will encourage players to check back in every day. It looked awesome on device as well, and I was happy with how everything is progressing. Now, it was day 7, the end of the first week. I like how the shop rotated daily, so I wanted something else to encourage the player to check back in every day. My wife had the idea to create a scene where you can wish on the stars and get some free items every day. So I put together the animation of a shooting star with the starry background, and then implemented it into the game. When you make a wish, you can either get a random number of seeds or a random amount of gems. On day 8, it was time to implement the hunger and happiness system. This was relatively straightforward to implement. I added a panel to the side where you can choose what to feed your pet. I also added these emojis into the game. When your pet is hungry, it's sad, but when fed some food, it shows a heart. I also made it so when you crank, you pet your pet. This was an absolutely critical feature. For Tamagotchis, if you leave your pet unattended too long, it dies, but I didn't make that the case from the game since it seems a bit harsh. However, I might change that in the future since I guess it's a pretty good incentive to keep playing. Back when I added all the different pet types, I've been meaning to make a way for you to have a bunch of different pets and switch between them, so I created a separate scene to do that. The stats listed out below was an idea that I had that ended up going in a different direction, but I'll get to that later. For day 9, the first thing I wanted to do was make a way for you to get and name your pet. For the Tamagotchi, you start off with an egg, so I decided to do that as well. You crank to shake the egg and crack it open, and it pulls up this keyboard you can use to name your pet. This is what you'll see when you first boot up the game to get your first pet. Right now, there's currently no way to get a new pet or to even upgrade the garden like I mentioned before. So for my next task, I added that into the shop as an option that always appears. On day 10, it was time to start working on the minigame. This was one of my biggest gripes with the original Tamagotchi, which was that the guessing game is extremely uninteractive. I started researching some other virtual pet games for inspiration. One I saw a lot was the Chow Garden from Sonic Adventures 2. It seemed that part of why people liked it a lot was because it had a really good game loop, where the main Sonic game would have items and pickups that would feed into the Chow Garden. I also liked the concept of the minigame being a battle, like with the original Digimon toys, but I disliked how it was luck-based, basically being glorified rock, paper, scissors. So my game would ideally 1, have things that you feed your pet somehow affect the game, bridging the core game and the minigame, and 2, be somewhat skill-based. I originally wrote down this design for a symbol game where you fire an arrow and use the crank to influence the direction of the arrow, and things you fed your pet would affect your stats related to the game, but I realized there was too many plants and there wasn't even enough stats that could be impacted in the game, so I decided to switch to another idea. I started imagining it to be something like Mega Man Battle Network, or One Step from Eden. A kind of simplified grid battler where the grid is a garden and you can plant things, and when they grow you harvest it and it sends out an attack or has a special effect. The plants that you had available would be determined by the last 10 things you fed your pet, so you can create a custom deck of sorts. I learned that there was a Mega Man Battle Network virtual pet toy as well, so that tied in pretty well. This fulfilled my 2 criteria, but it was pretty complex. I had less than a week left, and there were still other things to do than just the minigame, but I really liked the idea, so I decided I would just bite the bullet, crunch hard, and try to make it. I first created the slicing animation, and then implemented the basic grid movement, planting, and harvesting. It was feeling pretty fun and fast-paced, so I felt more confident in the direction that I was going in. I found this asset pack that had a lot of cool 1-bit monsters, so I used these and created a system to easily create enemies where I can define movement and attack patterns. I then went ahead and added all the base elements. That included the health bars at the top and also this queue of fruit or vegetables on the left that showed what seed was next. You can see in this clip I'm fighting the Cerberus enemy, who has an X and plus attack pattern, along with warning indicators, similar to One Step from Eden, and a simple death animation. I then tied everything together by spotting a new enemy when the last enemy gets defeated. There's currently 13 different enemy types with differences in attack patterns, health, how fast they move, and more. For example, the Cyclops moves very slowly with a single target attack, but does a lot of damage. But the Kitsune moves faster and has a vertical column attack. Stronger enemies spawn at later levels. For example, the Mimic has a row attack, but it's weaker than the Phoenix's row attack. I'm planning on doing a content update next week, so I'll probably add more enemies in there. All the plants have different effects too. For example, the turnip is the most basic. It grows quickly, but does only a little bit damage and hits a single square. The eggplant grows slower, but it does more damage. The pumpkin grows even slower, but attacks all 3 squares. The strawberry is a utility fruit and causes all the other plants to instantly grow. I wrapped up the battle minigame by creating a results screen, which shows you how many gems you've earned, experience you received, and what level you ended up with. Each of your pets has a level associated with it, and it ended up scaling how much health you have based on your level later on. I wasn't sure if I should scale the player damage based on level, and I think the battles can most likely be paced and balanced better. So if you have a playdate and end up playing the game, I would love to get some feedback. Since what you fed your pet is important, I made it show up in the pet selection screen. This way you can keep track of your quote-unquote deck. By this point, I was already on day 12, and there was still work to be done, mainly the sound effects. So I spent all of day 13 in Audacity and put together every single sound effect. It was so much work. I regret putting off everything until the end, but here's a few examples of what I came up with. The last day I spent fixing a bunch of bugs, balancing the battle, and making this title card for the game. If you have a Playdate, you can get this game today. And if you're interested in the source code, you should check out my Patreon. What do you think about my take on the Tamagotchi-style virtual pet game? Do you think I did a good job, or what would we have done differently? Let me know in the comments. I post Playdate-related content every single week, so subscribe if you're interested. See you next Monday.